This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
What do you guys want to talk about?
Well, interestingly enough, as I scroll through my notes here, wouldn't you know it, I was able to somehow whittle everything down to about 15 pages. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Aren't 15 pages of notes still a lot to be had for 2 wrestling recaps? Well, arguably yes. Especially when you factor in that Retro Raw is only 45 minutes at the moment. And I skip over about half of SmackDown to begin with. Or maybe it's just the fact that within the last 2 weeks, we've done 2 consecutive Royal Rumble recaps, and those ate up about 3/4 of my overall notes. In the case of last week, most of it was me writing how much I despised everything about that Bray Wyatt match. And I use the term match as loosely as I can. Luckily this week, I think I narrowed my Bray Wyatt note-taking down to about 1 or 2 sentences. He was only on camera on SmackDown for approximately 15 seconds, and that was it. Never saw him again. It was still about 15 seconds too much, but it's better than 15 minutes, which was about how much time they allotted to him at the Rumble. And while the reduction of Bray Wyatt material did not make SmackDown any more enjoyable or watchable, it helped massively. Retro Raw more or less was the usual, and we will review both in a minute. I did not pre-plan any rants or tirades at the top of this week's program, which I'm sure will leave many of you disappointed. It was nice to be able to wake up on Sunday and realize that I did not need to devote half the day to piecing together the podcast and catching up on notes from previously watched shows. Also nice to be able to get to bed at a reasonable time on Saturday night, because I wasn't up at the butt crack of dawn like I was watching the 2023 Royal Rumble. The show that, as I joked about last week, may still be going on as of this current recording. There may still be people in the Aladome right now watching janitors clean up the debris of Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens' dead bodies after the bloodline got through with them. The only thing we can hope for is that their filler premium live special before WrestleMania doesn't go the same length. Whatever that show's even called. I think it's the Elimination Chamber. God almighty. Yeah, because they had to name a pay-per-view Elimination Chamber, even though they usually only have like 1 or 2 of them. I can't remember. What was the pay-per-view that they actually debuted that match? Because wasn't that an Eric Bischoff idea? I remember when they first announced the Elimination Chamber, I was like, oh, that's kind of a cool gimmick. I think they did it at like a Big Four special or something like that back in the early 2000s, and overplaying their hand to the point where it just becomes so redundant because you see the same gimmick match every year, and it's like I complained about with the Royal Rumble. Used to be a cool concept, and then they just kept doing it year after year after year after year, and they all just started to blend together, just like every gimmick match WWE does. God. It's a shame to see where we've come to in this business. But I don't even know what I was getting at with the Elimination Chamber thing. Well, they've already started the build for the card. We'll talk about that more in the SmackDown review. For the time being, though, we can begin our Monday podcast with the Retro Raw Report as we're edging our way toward WrestleMania 10 and continuing to assemble the card for that show. Mentioning before how it was crazy to remember that even back in the mid to late 90s, how far in advance the WWF used to book and plan out their big pay-per-view cards. By the end of last week's Raw, not only do we know both title matches being set up for WrestleMania involving Luger, Brett, and Yokozuna, but we've also established Brett versus Owen, which was all based on the fallout from the angle they shot at the Royal Rumble the previous weekend. And by the end of the February 7th Raw we're going to be talking about right now, we also established the Randy Savage Crush match, which I believe was a feud that they started the build for as far back as October of the previous year, when Crush turned heel and sided with Mr. Fuji. Again, man, we joke about how Vince totally lost his mind in the last 15 years and how quick he was to either drop things or radically change up gimmicks and storylines for seemingly no reason, be it he got bored with something or just outright forgot about it. But seriously, go back to this period when Vince was at least somewhat cognizant of his surroundings. Even if the product was mostly shit and everyone was saddled with a goofy gimmick of some sort, at least you could sit down and watch these shows and rationally see how they were setting up cards for their Big Four pay-per-views throughout the year. They used to plan this stuff out far in advance. The programs might have not always been the best in terms of quality matches, but you could at least see the logic of how they were getting from point A to point B to point C, etc. Getting into this show, though. So I've talked about how when it comes to my note-taking, it's usually a bunch of scatterbrained bullet points, and while I'm sitting here recapping segments, I try to make coherent sentences out of a lot of the crap that I write down. These two particular back-to-back bullet points were so perfectly notated, I had to articulate these exactly as they read in my notes. Here are the first two things I wrote about Monday Night Raw from February 7th, 1994. Recap of Sean Waltman committing theft. Bastion Booger Fuck. All in caps, by the way. Now, if you watched last week's Retro Raw report, you will know that the first bullet point actually pertains to storyline follow-up. The 1-2-3 Kid stole IRS's briefcase that contained Razor Ramon's gold chains. So while Marty Jannetty and IRS were fighting at the commentary desk, there's one-legged Sean Waltman gimping his way up the aisleway with IRS's briefcase in hand, completely able to outrun a perfectly mobile athlete in the process. The second bullet point pretty much says everything in those three words alone. Bastion Booger Fuck. I don't think I need to elaborate any further on that statement. While Vince was running down the card for the night, Bastion Booger was standing next to him scarfing down nachos and making fart jokes. Because, Vince humor. I probably should have figured that the mere sight of Bastion Booger on camera was an omen for how the show was going to go. Little did I know what I was in store for. If you weren't sick of Bastion Booger within the first 15 seconds of the show, good luck getting through another 40 minutes of him. But the train wreck immediately began within the first 5 minutes of the television show, with easily one of the single worst squash matches I think I've ever seen. The match is the Smoking Guns versus Reno Riggins and Barry Horowitz. And I actually had to go back and replay the sequence of botches like 4 times in a row just to make sure that I captured the whole thing. Because after rewatching it several times over, I'm still not entirely sure what the hell happened here, other than the simple fact that these guys were on completely separate pages when putting this thing together. It begins with Billy fighting back on Horowitz and Riggins when they had him tied up in the corner. At which point, Billy begins slowly making his way over to tag in Bart. And instead of Bart waiting to actually get the tag, he proceeds to go up to the top rope and hit a flying crossbody attack onto Riggins and Horowitz, at which point Vince says, "Well, I'm not exactly sure that was a legal tag." And that was bad in and of itself, because then the referee just let Bart in there and didn't do anything about it. But that spot was immediately followed with Bart taking Horowitz into one corner of the ring. And while Billy and Riggins are at the opposite end, it was obvious what they were going to set up here. They were going to do the do-si-do spot where the Guns Irish whip the jobbers into one another, and they would do the comedic head bonk spot. It's been done a million times throughout the history of wrestling, so you're probably wondering to yourself, how does one fuck up the double bonk spot? Well, here was the problem. While Bart is setting up Horowitz to do the Irish whip, Riggins is in the other corner throwing punches to Billy. So in order for them to pull off this spot, Riggins would have to Irish whip Billy out of the corner, wherein Billy would then have to reverse the Irish whip in order to send Riggins at Horowitz. And they fucked this spot up so badly to where Bart whips Horowitz about a year too soon out of the corner, and at the point Billy begins whipping Riggins toward him, Horowitz has to stop dead in his tracks, otherwise he would have had enough time to run all the way across the ring before he had a chance to even collide with Riggins. So, at the point Billy finally throws Riggins toward Horowitz, Horowitz then tries to flip Riggins over his head so that he can land on his feet. Except not only does Riggins completely eat shit on the landing, but Horowitz, in realizing that there was no possible way of saving this, looks down at Riggins with the best "what the fuck" expression I have ever seen. And finally, Billy and Bart just double-team Horowitz in an effort to attempt to make chicken salad out of the chicken shit sandwich they dealt themselves. I kid you not, I went back and watched this like 8 times in a row, trying to figure out what went wrong here, who was at fault, who screwed up first. After going back and watching it from several different angles, trying to see who was out of place first or who wasn't communicating the spot well enough, I determined that all 4 guys were at fault here. This was one of the single biggest clusterfucks I think I've ever seen happen in a professional wrestling match, and this all happened within the first 2 minutes of the opening bell. Keep in mind, too, the match itself probably went about 4 minutes and change. Vince called this a dysfunction. I called it embarrassingly wretched. The only other thing I noted here was the conversation between Vince and Bash and Booger, where they were talking about Booger looking for tag partners in the WWF. And the conclusion was that Booger had been seeking out tag partners that were in just as good of ring shape as he was. To which I noted, so even Bash and Booger was ribbing himself over the fact that he was morbidly obese. Billy and Bart won with some kind of double-team backbreaker combo. I wrote down, worst match of 1994. Even worse than the casket match between Taker and Yokozuna at the Royal Rumble. This is one of those matches where you go into Webster's dictionary and you try to find as many terms to describe something horrific as you possibly can. As of this recording, I think I'm still working my way through the D's. Then following that absolute abomination, we had Brett and Owen in separate sit-down interviews covering the Royal Rumble incident. Owen talked about how good it felt to kick Brett's leg out of his leg. Said he should have done it a long time ago, and he will never forget the fact that Brett stole Owen's moment away from him to become the WWF Tag Team Champions. I believe he called these the most important belts in the professional wrestling business. I laughed. And Brett, on the other hand, kind of reiterated the talking point he made a few weeks back, saying that he refused to fight Owen for a reason, and he was hoping things would boil over once they got back on the same page. But now it's obvious that he's going to have to take matters into his own hands and deal with Owen personally. He doesn't want to, but that is where we've come. And there was more to come with Owen after the break, but I'll say this. For anyone that didn't check out the Royal Rumble 94 review I did, for the sake of understanding the context of the Owen Brett story headed into WrestleMania 10, you've got to go out of your way to check out that show. Not just to get my reaction to the infamous "I kicked your leg out of your leg" promo, but on a more serious note, just to sort of understand the full picture of why I considered this the best period of Owen's career. He was absolutely on fire from Rumble season all the way through WrestleMania. And as we cover the next few months of television, you're going to see that confidence level in Owen really come out. I mean, he was good as a babyface, but man, oh man, heel Owen Hart. It was like a whole other world. The level of charisma that guy exuded on television was brilliant. It's basically on par with how great Brett was when he was doing the whole Team Canada thing. You know, I've talked many a time on my opinion of Bret Hart from a young age, but when he was doing the heel stuff later in his career, that was where I started to finally turn the table on him. Because generally I would say that I always kind of wanted to hate Bret to begin with. So, you know, when he was going around the States and admonishing all the local towns, talking about how superior Canada was, that's when I was like, fuck yeah, that guy's awesome. 94 was still at the point where anytime I saw Bret on TV, he just put me to sleep, especially when he was doing promos. But going back to the Owen thing for a minute, watching him in the squash match with John Paul, again, man, the charisma this guy exuded as a heel on camera was phenomenal. Like him going out on the floor and tearing up the signature shades in front of a kid in the front row, talking about how much better than Bret he was, bad-mouthing the crowd and trying to show off how much more athletically gifted he was than Bret. Just, I don't know, man. It was so fun. Seeing Owen being a self-entitled douchebag on camera. Because, like, in a sense, you knew Owen was playing a role, but it was so believable. You could actually buy that he was the younger, jealous brother. You could buy that he was the guy that really always viewed himself in the shadow of Bret, and that he was sick and tired of being seen as the inferior brother. Like, I don't know. It would have been interesting to go back in context over the years and get a little more insight on whether or not Owen was really playing this gimmick to full effect. You know, unfortunately, he only lived for another several years, so we never really got to hear any Owen post-career stories about this. But man, even to get Bret's perspective on it would be one thing, too. I don't know. I love this stuff. Talk about how great Owen was at this point in his career. I can't put him over enough. This was by far my favorite period of Owen's career, bar none. Would have been 1,000 times better if Vince and Booger weren't making Booger Mania and pizza jokes the entire time. Because, you know, Bash and Booger was fat.
He's fat!
On the subject of Bash and Booger and pizza, while he was choking on said pizza and turning visibly red on camera, probably legitimately choking as he shoot, Vince pitched it to Paul Bearer in the graveyard so he could vow that the spirit of The Undertaker will live once again. He essentially told us that we need to have faith and believe in the power of rebirth. And if you think I'm making any of this shit up, from Bash and Booger choking on pizza to Paul Bearer hanging out in the graveyard in the middle of the night with the WWF camera crew, Think again. I do a good deal of exaggerating when it comes to recapping these wrestling programs. I am not making any of this up in the slightest. You can look it up for yourself if you don't believe me. From there, we had our featured match for the program. It's IRS versus Marty Jannetty, as they announced from last week's show, all stemming over a stolen briefcase. And again, if you watch this match on mute and pay no attention to Bastion Booger's grotesque commentary, where he's talking about licking food grease off of his elbow, it was a fine little TV match. You know, very basic stuff with both guys before they fed to their first commercial break. Right before they cut away, we see Jacques and Pierre coming down the aisleway to, cough, cough, observe up close and personal. And at that point, you start to think that these guys are going to be factoring into the equation somehow as the match rolls along. Well, they come back from break, and Vince says, well, the Quebecers have been sent to the back. At which point they show a replay where the heels tried to attack Jannetty on the floor behind the initial ref's back. And while that's going on, another ref runs out from the back, and he ejects both of them from ringside. And it was at that point where I thought, how is it that we never see that in today's business? You see how many guys running blatant interference behind the ref's back during a match, no one ever comes down to do anything about it, up to and including the other officials? Most of the time, I just presume they're either not paying attention or they're somewhere in catering. But it just so happened that in this match, there was another ref on standby that was watching from Gorilla, and when he saw Jacques and Pierre attacking Jannetty on the floor, he said, well, I'm going out there to give these guys the boot. Can't have that. This is Marty Jannetty versus IRS. We must have a clean match. It's almost like you'd figure you would see that more often in the business. But apparently not. So from there, IRS is getting heat on Jannetty. And as Jannetty begins to make his comeback, who should then come out from the back but Johnny Polo with a hockey stick? And upon considering what we just saw several minutes ago with one set of heels getting kicked out from ringside for getting involved, one would have thought that the referees would be down to ringside immediately to give Johnny Polo the same treatment. Figuring that, well, they don't need to see the guy do anything mischievous. The guy's a heel. They can safely assume he's going to be up to no good anyway. Well, no officials came out. Razor came down to sort of even the playing field. And while the match is continuing, here come the Quebecers for a second time. Not flanked by referees or security. They just casually meander down to the ring with no one coming out to do anything. And while Jannetty gets knocked out to the apron, IRS turns his back with the official long enough so that Johnny Polo can shove Jannetty back into the ring after the attempted springboard leap, at which point IRS gets the pin on Jannetty, and then things break down with the baby faces and heels alike. Eventually, Razor and Jannetty are able to fend off the Quebecers, and Razor gives Pierre the Razor's edge, after which Bastion Booger informed us that he was hungry for some hot dogs. And that was pretty much the entirety of that segment. So, just to recap all of this for a minute, to ensure that we're all on the same page with this completely unflawed WWF booking circa 1994, here's what we established. It is apparently not okay if you run blatant interference during a match for the first time, but if you get ejected from ringside, you are then permitted to come back out and run blatant interference a second time, and that will not get you ejected from ringside. That is perfectly fine. Huh. The more you know, I guess. Ain't that pro wrestling logic for you? But hey, at least we get a title match out of it in 2 weeks. And yes, you heard that right. 2 weeks out. Reason for that being that next week, Raw is preempted by the Westminster Dog Show. Boy, does that bring back some vivid memories. So there will not be a Retro Raw episode to cover next week. Well, that's a shame. Whatever will I do without being able to cover Retro Raw? Am I going to have to find a substitution segment for next Monday's podcast, in addition to the SmackDown report? Guess I'm going to have to figure that one out in the meantime. Elsewise, next week's show is going to be relegated to just the SmackDown report. I guess I can easily go on another 2-hour tangent and talk about how hideously appalling that show is. But I'd probably give myself a seizure by the end of it. I'll think of something. We've already done the Royal Rumble reviews, so I'm trying to think of what else I can cover in the realm of WWF content. I mean, I've done classic retro pay-per-views before. I think I did an In Your House show from like early 96 last year as part of the substitution segment on a show. It might have even been around this time, because this sounds about the period where the Westminster Dog Show preempted Raw. Perhaps I could find another show to review. I can try to find out what notable wrestling events happened on February 14th in history. Off the top of my head, nothing's coming to mind. But we'll see if I can find anything. In the meantime, you know what time it is, right? It's time for the TV debut of Sparky. Thurman Spark Plug, to be specific. You might better know him as Spark Plug Bob Holly. And the reason you may not recognize Thurman Plug is that they very quickly realized that in addition to the gimmick itself being Death TV the minute they aired the first vignette, they also quickly caught on to the fact that the name Thurman was even worse than the actual fake NASCAR gimmick. So, yeah, it wasn't too long from now where they ended up just calling him Spark Plug Bob Holly instead. Still an awful name nonetheless. And they still kept the god-awful gimmick for the next several years, but at least he kept the name Bob Holly. And for his Raw debut match, he wrestled Dwayne Gill. So for all you Attitude Era lovers out there, you can officially jot down in the record book that we indeed saw Hardcore Holly versus Gillberg in 1994. And as much as I constantly harp on how bad a lot of the Attitude Era was, at least Hardcore Holly and Gillberg were over as characters, as opposed to Spark Plug Bob Holly, which was, as I noted a minute ago, the pure definition of Death TV. They wrestled for a few minutes, and Sparky went over with a diving knee drop to the gut. Vince, I believe, called this the overhead cam. Yeah, you heard that correctly. The overhead cam. Even the finishing name was a steaming turd. Couldn't even call it something catchy like Maximum Overdrive. That would at least sounded cool. Now they had to call it the overhead cam. Ugh. And if you weren't sick of it after 2 appearances, get ready. Because there's plenty more to come when it comes to talking about Spark Plug Bob Holly over the next 3 years. Give WWF credit where it was due. They were smart enough to drop a lot of shitty bad gimmicks around this period. We talked about recently, they finally canned Ludwig Borga after it got over like a fart in church. But my God, it took them almost 4 fucking years to figure out how ridiculous Spark Plug Bob Holly was. How did he recover? Well, to be fair, I don't think he ever really did. I mean, Hardcore Holly wasn't even that over to begin with. I think he just rode Crash Holly's coattails for the better part of a few years when he was the Hardcore champion. So he managed to stay relevant. But, God, that guy was dealt the short end of the stick. Anyhow, moving on with things here. Todd Pettingill had another WrestleMania report. Talked about a lot of the same stuff he covered last week, but took a minute to recap the segment with Luger and Brett. The coin flip decision to determine who was getting the WWF title shot at WrestleMania first. And with Luger winning the coin toss, he gets the first crack at Yokozuna. So they had Jim Cornette and Mr. Fuji in a pre-tape with Yoko here, talking about how unfair and ridiculous it is that Luger's getting the first title shot, accurately describing how Luger technically is not owed a title shot, given the stipulations to their SummerSlam contract the previous year. Even though Corny's a heel, he's not exactly wrong when he says that Luger should not be getting another title match. But that's all I really gathered out of this. Todd Pettingill was in it, so I'd be lying if I told you I was paying close attention. And for our TV main event, Crush had a quick squash with a young chap who Vince referred to as Thornburg. If he had a first name, I don't believe it was ever mentioned. So for sake of argument, we'll just call him Teddy, because he looked like a teddy. Teddy Thornburg in his atrocious-looking singlet getting killed by Crush in a couple minutes. That was their TV main event, with Crush doing some of the worst fake karate chops I've ever seen. It sucked. My main takeaway was the mention of the stipulation to the Crush Macho Man match for WrestleMania. It is falls count anywhere, but in order to actually win, you must beat your opponent back to the ring by a 10 count. And admittedly so, while I did not have a whole lot of memories of the Crush Savage match from WrestleMania 10, at the point that they announced this wacky stipulation, I actually remember the finish they did for that match. Most notably because it was very hokey and cartoony. We'll get to it in due time. But for now, I guess we can wrap things up with the Retro Raw report. I also liked in one of their final segments, the Quebecers are backstage bitching about Jack Tunney signing off on the title match with them versus Jannetty and Razor in 2 weeks. And while Polo's pitching a fit going, "It's a conspiracy, McMahon! This is ridiculous! We shouldn't have to defend the titles! This is absurd!" You know, Pierre's punching a hole through the wall. They're just flipping their lid in the back, just overacting like great heels would. Meanwhile, Vince goes, "Oh, thank you, gentlemen." Very nonchalant. This was also, as I noted, very wacky. But I also expect nothing less of Johnny Polo circa 1994. He was quite the gimmick. But they did let us know again that Raw will not be airing next week. So we will have another gap week in the Retro Raw series before we jump back into things the following week. Again, I'll try to see if there's anything on the network that I want to throw in as a substitute portion for next week's Monday show. There have been some decent documentaries that I've skimmed over. I know they got plenty of content out there, but I don't know. I really enjoyed that Razor documentary I did last year. Didn't garner a whole lot of views, which is a shame because I also kind of did that as sort of a tribute after his passing. I'm hoping that if I decided to do another documentary coverage, it would at least get a little bit of traffic for the channel. Elsewise, it would just be a complete waste of time. I know people love hearing me shit on modern wrestling, and while that's fun as well, I also like to try and provide some actual serious content. So I'll do a little bit of homework in my downtime tomorrow and figure out if there's anything worth covering. Doesn't make any sense to do WWF pay-per-view recaps if we're just going to be talking about a lot of them as we progress through the archives. So if I can find something WWF or WWE related, not pertaining to TV shows or pay-per-view content, I might go with that. But I will let you know probably as early as Friday's show when I see you next. For now, though, how about we transition over to the SmackDown report, since I know you're all just dying to hear me rip into that thing. Shall we? Good God in heaven. Oh. I haven't even said one word about this show and I've already given myself a migraine. Here's all I can say at this point. As much as I sit here and talk shit on the dirt sheets and the wrestling media these days, thank Christ I don't do this for a living. If they paid me to report on this modern wrestling garbage for a living, telling you, man, I don't think I could do it. I'd have long since retired from the business. I'd have taken one look at the Uncle Howdy skits and said, you know what? Maybe this just isn't for me. Even if they gave me all the leeway in the world and said, you can crap on these shows as much as you want, but you have to watch every single segment and discuss everything at length. No fast forwarding, no glossing over anything. A full recap of the show from start to finish. I would have quit after the first show. I watch Dynamite and SmackDown every week, and I can barely make it through 50% of the bullshit I see on those shows. Telling me I'd have to sit through that, plus Raw, plus Rampage, plus whatever other dreck's being propagated out there in the market today, NXT. Good Lord, I forgot all about good old NXT rebrand. Yeah, think about that too. Do you remember when we reviewed NXT 2.0 for a period of time on this channel? For all of like a month before I gave up on it? It's been well over a year since I've come anywhere close to checking out any of the stuff that's been happening in WWE's developmental brand. I imagine it's more of the same from when I remember watching it before I quit. Most of it being garbage. But we've been doing these SmackDown reports for how long now? It's been at least several months. And here's a funny thing. I remember saying early on how the shows generally weren't that terrible. They weren't great, but like most of the time they weren't visually insulting. After going through this experiment for the better part of 4 months now, I would like for everybody to pause the show right now, open up your keyboards, or whatever device you happen to be watching this on, phone, doesn't matter. I would like for everybody to take the opportunity to admonish and shame me in the comment section for actually uttering those words aloud, saying that WWE Friday Night SmackDown was generally not a bad show. Boy, was I fucking wrong. I don't know what planet I was living on at the time, but I will happily eat my own words. I'm usually right about a lot of things. I want to write about this one. These SmackDown shows suck a mass cock. A throbbing cock. It's I don't even know how to describe it. It's not even in the same universe of how bad Dynamite is. Dynamite is shit too, but at least it's like WCW level bad to where I can get a good laugh out of the ongoing stupidity on that show I see every week. SmackDown is just putridly excruciating. And I only watch 2 hours of this WWE crap every week. I won't ever warrant putting myself through 3 hours of Raw. Not a goddamn chance. Tell you what though, man. If it weren't for the bloodline on this show, I would have given up on SmackDown by the second week we started reviewing it. There were like 2 good things on SmackDown this week. The first 5 minutes of the show and the last remaining 10 minutes. Oddly enough, both of them featuring the bloodline. And unfortunately, anything that happened in the middle was, well, the rest. And here was the problem with the first 5 minutes of the show being one of the best things in the entire 2 hours. 4 of those 5 minutes was a VTR of the closing angle to the Rumble pay-per-view. An angle that I would gladly go back and rewatch multiple times over before I ever subject myself to any replays of this show. Pretty much after that, it was all downhill until the last segment. Starting with the opener, it's Brawny the Strowman and Ricochet going up against Fabio Ichabod and Marcel the Shell. During the intros to this, I believe they mentioned something about how this was a number 1 contenders match to determine who would be wrestling the Usos for the tag titles. So already I was disinterested because that meant it was building towards another fucking Usos match that I'd eventually have to be subjected to. I was more so trying to figure out when in the hell Strowman and Ricochet became a tag team, or more importantly, how are these guys even factored into a tag team title tournament when they've had like maybe 2 or 3 matches as a team, period? And in fact, here it says in my notes, this was the finals to the tag team title tournament. Now, it should be fair, I did not watch the last 2 episodes of SmackDown because of the Royal Rumble shows we reviewed. So, it has technically been 3 weeks since we've caught up with everything on SmackDown. But did these people seriously have a 2-week-long tournament on the 2 episodes of SmackDown that we didn't review? How do you have a multi-person tournament in 2 weeks? Were there only 4 teams in the tournament to begin with? Or did they build the entire show around a bunch of tag tournament matches? Who was even in the thing to begin with? And how did Ricochet and Strowman make it to the finals as a makeshift pairing? All of these questions I'm still trying to find answers to. I mean, it wasn't a bad match. I don't really have much interest in seeing Ricochet and Strowman as a recurring tag team, but that could also factor into me just not caring all that much about Strowman at this point. I've already talked about how badly they've kind of neutered his comeback. He's literally just a dude on the roster now, and it's kind of unfortunate when you consider how over the guy was when he came back late last year. Yeah, the match also went way too long, which didn't help matters any. One of the angles they did midway through was Gunther shoving Ricochet on the floor in plain view of the referee, and instead of calling for the DQ, he just threw Gunther out from ringside. But fucking Ricochet and Strowman were miffed about that blown call. Those guys should have been declared the winners right there after the blatant interference. But instead, the match kept going through a goddamn commercial, at which point I kind of mentally checked out from it until the finish. Strowman made a decent big man comeback. Crowd was pretty hot when he was beeling both guys around the ring momentarily. And after Strowman nearly lost his balance trying to hoist up Marcel for the powerbomb, he tagged in Ricochet so he could get on Strowman's shoulders and kind of sort of roll off for a senton splash on a Marcel for the pin. Part of me was thinking he was going to try to do some kind of 630 splash or shooting star finish, which would have been quite impressive if he was able to pull it off, but for the sake of not breaking his neck in a complete throwaway TV match, the senton was sufficient enough. So it'll now apparently be Strowman and Ricochet getting served up to the Usos prior to WrestleMania, which is whatever. Again, I don't really care about the Usos matches one way or the other. No one buys that Strowman and Ricochet are winning the belts, so as a serviceable filler title program for TV in a week, cool. I might watch it, I might not. I'll see if I'm in the mood. At least I've got the layered story of whatever's going on with Jey Uso and the Bloodline right now to kind of make things interesting. Yeah, they already established at the top of the program that Jay's still in the doghouse after walking out at the Rumble and not helping the rest of the family destroy Sami. So who knows? They might end up booking an angle in that match to keep teasing the potential split with Jay. I still think the end goal is to do Sami and Owens versus the Usos in Mania for the belts. More than likely with Jay officially leaving Jimmy to take the fall and dropping the belts that way, which I think would be a fitting way to end the Usos' title reign, but we'll see what they do in the meantime. Jumping over to the girls' content for a minute here, because you all know I love me some girls wrestling, especially after that 45-minute tangent I did on the Rumble review. Well, we now know who Rhea Ripley is facing at WrestleMania. She chose Charlotte, which I kind of figured was the end goal, considering she's about 3 years overdue for getting her win back after Charlotte beat her in Mania for the NXT title for no apparent reason. Beyond the fact that WWE has a hard-on for that overrated blonde tramp, basically spelled the end of Rhea's push for the main roster as a star. Y'all remember how fucking over Rhea was in NXT right before they called her up to the main roster? As soon as they put her in a program with Charlotte, it was a downward trajectory from there. As is often the case with anybody that works with Charlotte in the WWE. Charlotte buried her, killed her momentum, and Rhea never recovered. So here we are basically 3 years later, and it looks like they're finally going to try to do some damage control. Too little, too late. If Rhea beats her, I'll be content. But as God is my witness, if they put Charlotte over Rhea again, I'll fucking riot. And I'll make sure WWE never hears the end of it. So at this point, they aired a VTR with Dominic and Rey Mysterio and a bunch of NASCAR dudes at the LA Coliseum. Also in the background were the Judgment Day minus Rhea plus the New Day for reasons that I don't believe were ever explained. Apparently they're getting ready for some big NASCAR event and WWE's doing promotion for it. And I'll be the first to admit, I don't give a shit about NASCAR. It's one of the dumbest sports ever created next to disc golf and soccer. But leave it to Dominic Mysterio to not only get me to love a segment he was involved with pertaining to NASCAR, but also get me to love a segment he was involved with. And it had the New Day in it. That takes true skill and aptitude to get me to like something on the show involving the fucking New Day. And even though their contribution was slim, It's still the New Day. And albeit, I had no idea who the hell half these people were, mostly because they were all NASCAR celebrities, therefore I didn't care. But when Ray and Dom set up an impromptu race showdown here, and you got Dom talking about he woke up pissing excellence that morning, making fun of the old guy for wearing pajamas when it was clearly a protective bodysuit. Meanwhile, there's Balor and Priest cheering from the sidelines like a bunch of tools. And of course, things immediately get dumber and hokier when they actually start the race and you got the fucking graphics for Dom's car and Ray's car popping up on screen to show who's in the lead. And they're both doing clearly canned artificial promos from one another inside their vehicles, talking shit back and forth. I think it was supposed to sound like one of those old CB radio things. Like Dom's in there talking about how his cellmate was an ex-con getaway driver. So, of course, now he just knows how to operate a race car all of a sudden. Because lest we forget, the angle from Christmas Eve where Dom was arrested at Ray's home for breaking and entering. Dom went to prison. Wish they could have showed us more vignettes of that. And Ray won the race. Dom claimed that he cheated and that if Mommy were there, things would have ended differently. This was beyond fucking idiotic in every conceivable way imaginable, but it was also fantastic at the same time because Dom Mysterio is the best character on this show right now. Discount Roman or Sami. And if you also completely ignore every gaping plot hole imaginable, such as how in the teetotal titty fuck did Ray and Dom know how to all of a sudden drive race cars? Or how did Dom in the Judgment Day manage to crash a segment with Rey Mysterio at a race car track at the LA Coliseum? Moreover, why was Rey Mysterio at a racetrack at the LA Coliseum? If you ignore all sense of logic and coherency and just watch this segment in a vacuum, view it for how stupid it was from beginning to end, I might have lied with what I said at the top of the program. This might have been the best thing on the entire show. And Dom Mysterio, man. I don't even know how to describe him at this point. He's like easily at the top of my guilty pleasure list when it comes to anything I watch in wrestling in 2023. He's so horrendously awful that it exceeds awful and now is just purely entertaining. He's the best fucking smarmy heel on this entire show. And I'm telling you, man, I cannot wait for that showdown with him and Ray at WrestleMania. For all the time they spent teasing this program, there's no way that match isn't happening. I just hope to God they don't make it a multi-person match. Like, you know, the Judgment Day going up against Ray and two partners. Like, even if they do that at the Elimination Chamber show, I could deal with it. You know, like some kind of six-man tag, but, you know, at least they tease the idea of Ray and Dom squaring off, but they don't actually go all the way with it. For a fact, though, Ray and Dom in a one-on-one match, that needs to happen at WrestleMania. Night 1, night 2, it doesn't matter, but they need to book it. Because they've spent way too long teasing this program for them not to do it. So, yeah, I love this. It was absurdly dumb, but I'm telling you, man, Dom is so good in this heel role. I can't help but not be entertained by anything I see of him. And by the way, this just came to me as I'm sitting here recording this. Did they ever explain what happened to Ray at the Rumble that prevented him from coming out? Did Dom actually attack him in the back? Because here he was, perfectly fine. Not a scratch or bruise on him. No one ever brought it up on commentary, so I presume whatever happened must have been resolved. Or maybe they just forgot about it and moved on, because that's what usually tends to happen with things in modern wrestling. Just randomly dropping storylines for no apparent reason and pretending like it never happened. Wouldn't be the first time we've seen it. So from there, it was right back in the middle of this shitstorm of a television show. Charlotte and Sonya Deville had an absolutely abhorrent match for the SmackDown Women's title. I've already taken Charlotte to the woodshed for how horrible her rope running is. She still can't even do a believable looking lockup. They both did a bunch of choppy spots for a while, one of which included a sequence where Sonya hit the ropes to charge back at Charlotte, and Charlotte did that dumbass-looking frontward cartwheel into clothesline. That looked awful the last time she did it. Looked sloppy as shit. So, of course, she did it again, and it looked equally as bad. Her Ric Flair chops are also hideous. It's like I'm watching her do it in slow motion. Which really isn't exclusive to the chops. A lot of stuff Charlotte does looks like it's in slow motion. I wrote down, Charlotte predictably wins with the figure 8. Match went way too long, and it sucked. Getting past that as quickly as possible, though, we had Roman Reigns in the back admonishing Solo and Jimmy for not being in communication with Jay over the week. He's apparently been radio silent. Ghosting, for lack of a better term. And, well, Roman's none too pleased about that, especially with the urgency of needing to get Jay on the same page because they have a title defense next week with Strowman and Ricochet. So he tells Jimmy and Solo to hit the bricks and hunt Jay down. And it would appear, given the scenario, the bloodline is continuing to show signs of wear and tear. They're not all on the same page. And if they don't get their act together soon, it could spell bad news for the bloodline come WrestleMania. Which is both great storytelling and heartbreaking at the same time, because as much as I love everything they're doing with the dissension story, it also evidently means that this group is bound to split within the next few months. Which then means that the only redeeming quality about SmackDown, outside the 2-minute vignettes we get with Dom Mysterio on occasion, is about to get wiped out entirely. So that also sucks. But we're going to make up for some time here. Butch and Ridge Holland wrestled the Viking Raiders. It went about 10 minutes. Viking Raiders won pretty much clean with a double-team powerbomb. I wrote down, weren't the Brawling Brutes one of the most heavily pushed teams on this show late last year? Now they're just getting beaten flat like it's nothing. I mean, I guess it's fine. I wasn't really digging the group that much from the beginning. This was more so done to set up the post-match angle with Sheamus and Drew McIntyre jumping the heels at the top of the stage. Apparently they shot an angle last week where the Viking Raiders attacked them in the aisleway. So I guess that'll be another TV program in the short term. Not exactly how I pictured them utilizing McIntyre or Sheamus right now, but I mean, with everything else going on, it's not like they're really being factored into anything important at the moment. So, why not? When in doubt, slap some dudes together in a tag team and see what happens. Maybe it'll accidentally get over. Wouldn't be the first time we saw makeshift tag teams get over more than they had any right to. So, well, immediately following that, Michael Cole and Wade Barrett actually had the gall to air a replay of the Mountain Dew Pitch Black match. at which point I left the room to vomit uncontrollably. And when I came back into the room, not only was Shotzi Blackheart making her way to the ring via tank, but they were announcing that this was a number one contenders fatal four-way qualifier for the Elimination Chamber match involving the girls. And immediately upon hearing that, I turned back around and I walked out of the room and said, fuck no. But at least at that point, I established what match that I will be skipping out on at the next Premium Live special. I will spare you the preordained rant. Yes, they are now giving the girls a featured Elimination Chamber gimmick match. Because, you see, the guys get to do it. Therefore, it is only fair that the girls get to do it too. Yeah. This is what we've come to in modern wrestling. So then I came back into the room to hear Roman offer catering service to Jimmy and Solo as an apology for blowing up at them earlier. He told them to go to the bus and enjoy the meal because Roman and the Wise Man have some business to attend to in the ring, which promptly led us into our final segment of the show. Roman and Paul come down for a promo, and within the first minute of this segment, before any material was established, my worst fears came true with what I was predicting coming out of the Royal Rumble. Roman's in the ring, and he's talking about how he'd like to divert his attention to talking about Cody Rhodes, since he's the official number one contender to the Universal title at WrestleMania. But since everybody wants Roman to keep bringing up the past, that would mean that he has to acknowledge Sami Zayn. And when Roman brought up the idea that he would rather talk about Cody, guess what the crowd did? Yep. You guessed it. They booed. And as soon as Roman turned things over to talking about Sami, that's when the people lit up. And they started going ballistic. They started chanting, Sami, Sami, Sami. I was afraid of that. I was worried they were going to wind up shooting themselves in the foot by making Sami the number one babyface over Cody. It's a tough situation they're in right now because of it. Because we keep suggesting the idea that Cody ought to be the one to beat Roman for the title. But when you consider the reaction Sami was getting here, you're starting to get the vibe that maybe that's where the real money feud is. Cody and Roman right now doesn't have the same intrigue as Roman and Sami. Especially after all that time and dedication to building up the relationship with Sami and the rest of the bloodline. You know, and now they're in a situation where Cody's kind of getting shoehorned in, and I don't think the fans are accepting it. At least not now. So I don't know. This is a rare dilemma for WWE to where they actually managed to find themselves with two top babyface challengers lined up to foreseeably beat Roman for the top belt. And now I think it's a matter of trying to figure out which one is the better option. They both make all the sense in the world, but now I think it's a matter of trying to figure out which one the fans are going to take more kindly to. If they go with Cody, I'm concerned that people won't buy it like they would if Sami were the one to beat Roman. But here's the problem. with the way Sami's been presented on television, he's already been kind of viewed as the sacrificial lamb for the bloodline. Like, he's been a punching bag for them for so long. I don't know. While the fans still cheer him and love him to death, it doesn't make up for the fact that Sami's kind of been the lingering flunky for the bloodline since the beginning. You know, Cody at least comes off as a top guy in WWE. Sami hasn't for a long time. And I don't know, it's just one of those things where they beat him like a drum. They pounded him into oblivion so much. I just don't know if Sami beating Roman is the right call in terms of the overarching story of what they've been doing with Cody since he came back last year. It's a pretty tough situation to be in. Because either way you look at it, you can still find fault in the decision. You know, the other thing, too, with what they set up in this final angle, by the way, this is a fucking fantastic closing angle to the show. You know, I talked about how most of the SmackDown show sucked with the exception of all the Bloodline stuff. This final segment was great. I have no qualms about anything they did here. You know, Sami snuck in the back door and jumped Roman while he was trying to cut his promo. Got a huge reaction from the crowd. Everyone's going nuts. And while he's laying into Roman, you know, Roman starts making a comeback and he's trying to kill him with a chair. But Sami cuts him off with a great spear. Crowd erupts for it. He sends Roman and Paul Heyman up the aisleway. Sami grabs a mic and tells Roman that he was wrong about him all along. From day one, Sami never wanted anything out of Roman. Until now. Now he has a motive. And he wants the WWE Undisputed Universal Championship. And of course, everybody erupts on that announcement. And, you know, while Sami has his attention centered on Roman, that allows enough time for Solo and Jimmy to run in from behind to jump Sami. So they're laying waste to him. Jimmy sets him up in the corner with a chair wrapped around his neck and is Solo setting him up for the running hip attack. Roman gets in the way and tells Sami that if he wants a shot at the title, he's going to get it in Montreal at the Elimination Chamber. Sami broke up his family. He took everything from him. Roman gave him everything. So now Roman is going to take everything from Sami. And after they set this all up, it became abundantly clear there is no way on God's green earth that Sami's winning that fucking strap. Certainly not at the Elimination Chamber of all places. I mean, I guess as a hooking point, it's in Montreal, Sami's hometown. Isn't that one of the best WWE tropes in the world? Making sure the hometown hero loses. Vince loved doing that. So, I mean, there is that potential where they want to kind of linger that over the people as like a little bit of bait to hook you in, saying, possibility that Sami might win the title in his hometown. Could get an electric reaction if it happens. It's one of those things where you reflect back on everything they did, from the angle they shot at the Rumble to what they set up here. You know, it's Sami and Roman for the title at the Elimination Chamber 1 month before Mania. And it's just so sad that with all of this perfectly falling into place, it's the ideal moment for them to strike while the iron is hot and switch the belt over to Sami. And there's like 0% chance it happens. And I just wonder, man. I wonder, how does that change the dynamic of the card for WrestleMania? You know, this was very weird. I love this angle. They did a great job setting up the title match. And I'm just thinking, this would have been the perfect way to set up Roman and Sami for the title at WrestleMania. And they did it to set up Roman versus Sami for the title at the in-between Premium Live special before WrestleMania. And again, even though it's in Montreal, does anybody really suspect that Sami's actually going to win the belt? Do you really? I mean, it's one thing to suspend your disbelief for a little bit, but come on now. You're telling me all that buildup, that entire road of Roman Reigns as the champion for 700-something days or 800-something days, whatever they're at this point, it's been well over 3 years, and they're going to take the title off of Roman at the filler pay-per-view before WrestleMania, before Cody has a chance to get his? I'm not buying it. You know, even if they end up doing Sami and Owens versus the Usos for the tag straps, you got to ask yourself, is it going to have the same effect as Sami potentially getting the W over Roman? It's hard to say. Because it's like, yeah, you could put the tag titles on Sami and Kevin, but is it going to have the same effect as the idea of Sami beating Roman? I don't know. Again, it's all going to be based on the crowd response. It's one of those circumstances where they're not out of the woods yet. They've done a great job with this angle, and they're so close. They're like right on the precipice of making this the best storyline execution that WWE's done in well over like 10 to 15 years. Everything is just naturally falling into place, but there are a couple little side pieces that they still got to make sure they get right. And the title switch is the key part. They could go through all the layered stories they've done to get to this point, but if they don't get the right outcome at the end, it's all for naught. And this is going to be one of the biggest debates right now headed into WrestleMania in a couple months. Is it a wiser move to have Sami be the one to dethrone Roman? Or should they go with Cody as, I guess, what they were originally planning before the injury? Again, I don't really think you can argue that either is the wrong decision necessarily, but it's all about timing. It's about doing it at the right place at the right time. And right now, I think the fans are leaning more in favor of Sami than Cody. Now, it is possible for them to really turn up the heat with Roman and Cody prior to WrestleMania, but I still think there's more heat in the Sami-Roman singles title, or singles feud. That's all I'm saying. I'm just going by the way the crowd's been reacting to it. Things could definitely change, but I don't know, man. It is a very interesting time we're in right now. And we can all speculate about that for another time. Because for once, I didn't think we'd actually pull through with the show in record time. But I'm going to try and keep this one under 2 hours for a change. Maybe things will be different on next Monday's podcast when I decide to do another 40-minute rant on how much women's wrestling has killed the business in the last 5 to 10 years. But I don't think I have the energy like I did last weekend. We'll go ahead and quit while we're ahead of ourselves. And we will be back this coming Friday for the next installment of our journey through the classic archives and whatever journey it is we're taking with this AEW product. At one point, I would have called it a roller coaster ride of ups and downs. Now I think we're just going to call it the slow, steady descent from the mountain. It gets worse with each passing week, but it's a fairly gradual decline. It's not what you would call a steep plummet. Just gradually falling one show after another. It is far and away more tolerable than anything involving Bray Wyatt. At least I can give it that. Or Uncle Howdy. As long as AEW doesn't plan on doing any gimmick matches sponsored by Fanta in the next month where Orange Cassidy's throwing guys into pools of orange soda, I think we'll be in moderately good shape. We haven't seen them do any Mimosa Mayhem matches in the last couple years. So maybe AEW's finally learned their lesson from bad gimmick ideas. WWE, I think the jury's still out whether or not they've learned from any of their previous bad mistakes. As long as they're giving Bray creative input, you can safely assume most of it's going to be crap. I feel so bad for whoever ends up working with him in Mania. For the love of God, I hope it's not Uncle Howdy. That's the last thing we need to see is Bray Wyatt versus Uncle Howdy. Or even some combination of them in a tag match against two other guys. What if that is the plan? Could you imagine if they booked Bray Wyatt and Uncle Howdy against, name an underneath comedy WWE tag team that no one gives a shit about? Otis and Gable, for example. Or the fucking New Day. Ugh. Throwing up in my mouth just thinking about it. Anyway, we'll be back on Friday. Take care all. Peace out and fuck Bray Wyatt.